Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, what's my good side?
You don't have a bad side.
Oh. Hi. Jose. I know you. 50. I think that.
Kai, Mr. Kai.
Where's Dr. Kai?
He's so busy because he commutes now.
Yeah. He's going to Abu Dhabi.
He's not gonna be our friend anymore because. Shall we start? 10 minutes. You want to say something?
Yeah. So, hi everyone. Hi guys.
Yeah. Why not? You can move. Oh yeah, you can come here. Get closer. Closer is more fun.
It'll all be really intimate.
Oh yeah, awesome. Yes, please. No, it's fine. Yeah, I'll be there. Hombre, come in guys, come in, join. Are you coming for the meetup? Awesome. Grab a chair, Sit wherever you can, on the sides. ¿Qué tal, tío? ¿Cómo estás? All right, welcome everybody to our meetup special about storytelling. It's my great pleasure to introduce today Vijaya. Vijaya is a London School of Economics graduate, and she just moved to Dubai last year.
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
And she's from Canada, and she has been involved in social justice NGOs in Canada. And today she's going to explain to us how to do storytelling like a pro. So let's give a hand to Vijaya. And Vijaya, I'm going to give you a mic.
Oh yeah. So tell me what I'm supposed to do. Just put it over here.
The mic here.
This is very high tech for like a meetup group. Oh no.
Can I hold on?
Yes.
Can
Okay.
I put that on the corner like this?
Okay.
It's going to be good.
That's good.
Right. And do you have a pocket there? Do you have a pocket, a belt? Do you have a belt?
I don't have a belt. No.
Okay.
I can just keep it here. Yeah, that's fine. I won't sit on it. I'll keep it there. Hi everyone. I'm so excited about this. Thank you. Actually, this is the first time that I'm, I think, talking about storytelling in Dubai since I've come here. And I was introduced to Jose through Kai. I don't know if some of you know Kai, whom I met at this really cool pitch event. And he was like, you do storytelling, and I'm really into storytelling. And I find that I get that a lot. Every time I talk about what I do, people are like, storytelling, that's great. But I think it is kind of this really big umbrella buzzword right now. Everybody is talking about storytelling in different ways. And so one of the things that I'd really like to do today is kind of pare that down to what that means for the work that I do, and maybe how that can be adaptable for some of you in the work that you do. But before we start, we do have a presentation. And because we're kind of in this, yeah, it's very colorful and very visual, and you can all log in. So if you have your phones, you can take your phone out and go to 710stories.com. That's the name of my website / consultancy.
Great.
Thank you. And let me know when you're there. You'll go, once you're on that site, you can go to the projects page.
So you said the website is 710 Stories?
Yes. 7, 1 and 0 as numbers. Stories.com.
Like this.
Yes. Yay for napkins.
experiencing technical difficulties.
Are you guys all logged into thing? Okay, you're on the site. Then you can go to the projects page. Just follow the menu on top. No, back on top. Yeah.
You got it, guys?
Projects. So once you're on projects, you'll see a link for. Can I just show them your phone? Yeah. So it just says how to do storytelling. It should look like this. Okay. So just click on that link, and then that will take you to the presentation.
Wonderful.
So let me know when everyone is there. So it's a pretty simple, like, scroll down web page. You don't have to download anything. You can just follow along as we go through. Yeah, just there. Projects.
Vijaya,
Yeah.
when people load the pages, can you tell us how you end up in storytelling?
Yes, absolutely. That one, yeah. So, a little bit about me. Sorry, I'll just maybe let everybody take their their stuff. So I think this is probably true for all of us. I think that we're all storytellers, really. I think that we all have stories to tell. And for me, I think it wasn't really so much about storytelling. I'd like to be one of those people who say that from I was really young and I always wanted to do stories and I used to devour books. Kind of, yes, but not really. I think for me, the thing that came first was a passion about social justice and social change. So what I use stories for and what I do storytelling for is for social change. And that to me is something that I felt from a very young age. I think I've been a feminist since I was a toddler. I think every time I would see something or watch something, I feel like, well, why isn't that happening for somebody else? Or why does that person not have access? And I was in an environment, my family was very, very supportive about questioning and critical thinking, and so I think that was really important. And I remember when I was about 11, I was watching, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this mythological story called the Ramayana. It's called the Ramayana. Yeah, yeah. So it's a mythological story in Hinduism where there's a king and a queen. The queen is captured by this, this demon, this evil person, and she's taken away. And when the king fights and has this grand battle and gets her back, everybody in this kingdom is like, well, she's not pure anymore, right? Because she was with this this guy who captured her. Obviously, he must have made her impure, and through sexual assault and all of that other stuff. And so I really thought about. For me, when I was watching the Ramayana, my first question to my dad. I remember watching this with my dad every Sunday morning. It would come on TV. And I would ask my dad, why are they doing this? And she was ostracized because she was kidnapped.
At this point,
And
in Toronto?
no, I was in India at this time. Yeah. So at that, I don't think Canada ever heard about the Ramayana as opposed to putting it on TV on every Sunday morning. in India, we used to watch this every Sunday morning. And my dad was like, well, it's not that he wanted her to send her away. It's not like he didn't trust her. It's not like he didn't believe her. It's just that that's what the kingdom asked for. And I had this whole conversation with him about this story. And at the end of it, I was like, well, I don't understand, because half his kingdom are also women, right? What is the message he's giving for half of his kingdom? And my dad was kind of stumped, and he was like, oh yeah, actually I never thought about that, right? And I think more than anything, I was like, wow, I can use story to stump my dad. And I was like, this is great. I should, we should talk about equality and stories more often. And then I think, so ever since I studied political science and then I studied social justice, I've done work in Canada, in India, and in Ecuador. I've worked in public health with children who work on the streets, so street-involved youth, around violence against women, and around sustainability. Quite a large gamut of social change and social justice work. And in all of that, I've used art and storytelling in some way, and I find that it's always the thing that sticks the most. And that's why I've become more passionate about storytelling because I can see how it drives social change more so than the method, and that's where 7:10 evolved from. So when I had my son 3 years ago, he was born at 7:10 p.m. in September. And so that was like a year after he was born. 7:10 became my first entrepreneurial endeavor. And this is what's been happening ever since. So it's been 3 years old. In that time, I've done about at least like about 10 or so projects that are we'll go through some of them that I'd like to share with you. But I truly believe that change happens through narrative and through story. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's about me. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about what makes stories so crucial, right? And I don't know, I kind of also want to, if you have any questions or if you have comments around this, I really value everybody's inputs. So, at any time, if you feel like you have a question or you feel like you want to add something to what I'm talking about, please do so. I feel like we all have expertise in this room, so I'm here to learn and listen and share as much as I'm here to talk. And I also don't want to be the only person talking the whole time, so, please talk. So I think we know by a few different things. We know by experience, we know by cultural tradition, and now we know by science how amazing and crucial stories are. So let's talk about the science a little bit. When we hear stories and we hear a narrative, there's oxytocin that's released in our brains. How many of you know what oxytocin does? 3 people know what oxytocin does. What does oxytocin do?
It's the comfort hormone.
Yes, it is. It releases, it's a hormone in our brains that releases a ton of really good feelings. So it makes us feel more connected. It makes us more empathetic. It gives us empathy.
It's like ecstasy.
Is it like ecstasy? Sorry?
Is it like ecstasy?
Maybe. I'm sure it's a bunch of good stuff. And it allows for goodwill. Oxytocin is big, and we keep yearning for it. We want to come back to it. And so I think in our brains, when something like that gets released, we want more.
Is that why people get addicted to Netflix?
Yes.
Game of Thrones.
And then get very sad when it ends badly. But the second part of the science is around neuroscience. So Yuri Hansen from Princeton was tasked with the job of trying to map out what stories do in our brains and how the neuroscience works. And what stories do, when they put 2 people together and try to talk to each other and tell stories, the person who's telling the story and the person who's listening to the story, their brains are actually mirroring. So you've got the same parts of your brain that's firing up when you're telling a story. When somebody's listening to you, those same parts of your brain are also firing up. So it's really cool because it's a very compatible process. It actually allows for you guys to be on the same journey together. It also, what they found is that the kind of language we use when we're talking allows people to experience as they're listening. So the thing that stories do over, say, data and facts is, I can tell you running is good for you, right? That's probably, you're going to receive that in your brain in some way. But I can tell you that Joe runs 10 miles every morning and he has these benefits to it, and he's found that, he's a stronger person for it. Just in that simple way, there's a different part of your brain that's firing up. That's the sensory part. So the motor cortex of your brain is now active, and you are understanding the benefit of running in a very different way. And in that sense, it actually makes it supremely powerful. Because what sticks in our minds are when we experience and when the sensory parts of our brain are actually fired up. That's how we remember better, and that's how we take in and feel like we were actually there.
I also heard that there's no difference in the brain of doing something or rehearsing something as in a story. Is that
Yes, it actually feels like you're experiencing it and you're doing it.
the brain does no difference?
I don't know exactly whether they know. I mean, there might be some other parts of the brain that are fired up when you're actually doing stuff, but yeah, it's very, very similar.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you relate to somebody? Like when he tells you like the story, like he doesn't give it as an advice, give it as a story. Like the example of running. You said the example of running. So like what actually happened? Like I didn't catch the last part. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. So if you talk about running from the perspective of how somebody benefited from running, and just say that in a different way, very simply, it doesn't have to be a big, long story or a long narrative. It can be a simple thing. It makes it more memorable for the listener, and the listener actually retains that information in a more meaningful way. And so that is actually a very powerful thing. And there's a ton of people who've used this science to talk about stories as persuasion, right? And stories for how to change somebody's mind, how to make them maybe buy something, how to make them, follow an idea. And there are different ways you can use it, right? It is persuasive. It is influential. My way of using it is around the social justice part. I am not as interested in selling things as selling products. I do like the idea of selling ideas because I think ideas make you think. But I like the idea of more using stories to make people think than to make them do something that you want them to do. And I think that the method of storytelling as well, like data and like science and everything else, because it's so powerful, requires you to be critical of it. It actually is more powerful than data, so it actually requires you to be more critical of it. And we've seen this, right? We've seen how when stories are used for subversive outcomes. Can anybody think of an example when stories have been used for some negative consequence? Yeah.
Not negative, but in Turkey, there was a British lady and who invited a group, like maybe 50 people, in a restaurant, and then she just picked, two people, like each two people, but they don't know each other. They were different nationalities and different nationalities, and then we just sit someone on the table, and there was a menu, like starter, this dessert. But there was all questions, like starter questions, to know about each other. It's like, what is the most important thing that you have done, blah, 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 blah. And then we asked each other, we haven't seen these people again, but she said that it's important because when you just hear someone's story and you tell them, your life changes, because you touch some people, and when you say something, and then she just maybe take a different action, blah blah, inspires, and then you can change the other people's life that you are telling your story. She said.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very positive example. Can you even think of a negative example of like when storytelling has been used? Yeah.
Yeah, like movies when they smoke.
Yeah.
Like old movies, a lot of people smoke cigarettes, like in the 70s or in the 40s, like Mad Men and shows like that.
Yeah.
Women smoke, men smoke, dogs smoke, everybody smokes. So it's crazy. Like this is a bad influence.
Absolutely. And it creates a narrative, right? Mm-hmm. You're smoking because of the kind of person you might want to be. I mean, I think one of the clearest examples is war propaganda. I mean, you think about the posters that have been used around conflict and war. Those are stories, right? The story of what creates an archetype of a particular person. And that's the person that we need to bring down or whatever. So yeah, you have to be critical, I think, about it. I think storytelling, when we say it, it has this really cool, positive vibe to it, but actually it requires you to be critical in any other way. I think stories are also crucial outside of the science. We know by our own traditional cultural ways of knowing. Right? Can anybody think about how we know things? How do we learn from the time we're kids? Tales. Yeah, fables. Has anybody heard of Aesop's fables? The fairy tales. I mean, who doesn't know about Cinderella and stuff like that? As sad as that is.
Mythology also, like.
Absolutely, mythology. And I mean, those are strong, right? Like they're not telling you facts and data. Like you don't look at a dictionary about what bravery is when you're 5. Your parents are telling you a story about some little kid who was brave, and then you understand what bravery is. So humanist concepts and intergenerational learning has always been passed down by oral traditions of storytelling specifically. Hi. And I think this is an important piece to know, because sometimes we get carried away with the science when we know things are there, but there's a lot of legitimacy in the way we know from like traditional ways of knowing as well. In indigenous communities, there's this concept called carrying the fire. And in some native indigenous communities, they'll have these sessions where they do storytelling, and intergenerational learning is happening at those spaces. And there's a fire in the middle. And when the fire runs out, some person is tasked with carrying the embers of that fire right before it's done to the next camp or to the next community that might be doing something similar, with the idea that that is supposed to be passing on tradition and passing on knowledge. And I love that concept of carrying the fire, right? Like, how do you carry the fire and the spark from one community? Sorry?
This is in India?
No, this is in Native American indigenous communities. Yeah. And in Canadian indigenous communities as well. I think I think a lot of indigenous communities, both in Australia, and they have very strong oral storytelling tradition. And I think we all really did. Maybe we've lost some of that along the way. But I mean, in India, you have tons, you know. So I think that's a huge part as well. Outside of that, you have, I think the thing that brings it all together for me in terms of the work that I do is possibility, right? Stories allow for you to think about what is possible. And there's a literary critic, a Canadian literary critic and expert called Northup Frye. He wrote this amazing book, last century, in the 19th something, called The Fearful Symmetry. And he talks about the function of literature. When we think about stories and literature, what is its function in our world? What do they do? I mean, I can tell you what, when you study engineering, when you study math, you study accounting, you have a function, right? You know you're going to do something with it. What is the function of literature? Evoke emotions, but like what does it do? What do you do? What are you tasked with?
Story.
But even that, the story part, it's inspiring, it's inspiration, but it's imagination. Your sole task for literature is to spark imagination.
Are you talking about fiction or non-fiction?
Fiction, literature, fiction. And this is, it's a good clarification, because he was a literary critic, but he talked a lot about the importance of that being just imagination. 1500 years ago, we were writing stories about people flying in the air. Icarus was being melted, and chariots were being flown around in the air that would resemble jets if you try to explain it to somebody today. This is decades and eons before we actually had the technology, but we imagined it first. Literature and stories, when you task yourself with sitting down and telling a story, you are allowing yourself to engage in imagination, right? Anything is possible. You can imagine another world and whatever you want that world to be. And I think that is especially when you think about like social justice and what that means, it's all about imagining different things, about a different way of being.
Okay, so
Yes.
J.R.R. Martin, when he wrote Game of Thrones, he was trying to inspire people.
He might have been. Yeah, you're talking about think about everything that happens on that show. There is ice zombies and dragons, and we all buy it. It's like the biggest show ever. It's more popular. And we're sitting there being like, yeah, this seems cool. Yeah, I'll buy this. Ice dragons and whatnot. And we've gone back for more because it's.
But you still watch
Yes, absolutely, and that's the power of narrative. And I think, I want to talk a little bit more about that. So, I think, we understand why stories are great, why they're important, right? I think the other part that I want to talk about is, so what? Stories are great. What do we do with that? What are we actually talking about when we're talking about storytelling? The work that we do and the models that we use are sort of situated in 3 different ways. I think about methods, in terms of what are you actually going to do to tell the story. Are you going to use poetry? Are you going to use fiction, non-fiction, data visualization? Performative art. There's so many ways of telling stories. You have a ton of methods, folk tales, fables. And then you have narrative, right? Narrative, I think to me is key because it's not just one story, it's the collection of a number of stories to form an idea in your mind. Can anybody think about an example of a narrative?
Like a movie?
No, it's yeah, but those are all tools. Those are all methods, right? Film is a method, a musical is a method. The hero's journey is an element within a method. So what is a narrative? A narrative is something that we actually think about the world.
Think about what?
We think about it in terms of our world. I'll give you an example of a narrative. That's still a story. So a story will support a narrative, but a narrative is a way of thinking about something. So for example, we have a narrative that says women are emotional and men are not. That is a narrative that we all believe in our world in some way, or maybe we don't believe it.
Every concept or an idea or a belief.
But where do we get it from?
Values, society.
It is an amalgamation of everything that we have absorbed from it.
Yes. And a lot of that is informed by stories, right? The stories.
It's a mix of stories and facts and fiction. Everything.
But I think the way that we engage in those facts are sometimes the narrative is stronger, right? And I can give you, so for example,
There are good stories and facts out there in our life these days.
yes. But when I think about,
What is the difference between the story and the narrative?
so a story is like one piece, right? It's one method, it's one tool. A story can support a narrative or it can challenge it, but the narrative is your full set of beliefs. It's the framework upon which you might act. So if I believe that my narrative, or our collective narrative says that women are more emotional than men, that is a narrative that we buy into and we believe it. Sometimes. You can give people facts about, well, men get angry, right? We've all known men to get angry. They're actually encouraged to express aggression in a certain way, or encouraged to express their emotions through aggression. But we don't consider that emotional, right? When I talk to people about, say, this kind of narrative, the power of it is that even though you're given examples of where something might be different, people really hold on to it. Right? They hold on to this idea that actually, no, women are more emotional. And it's not that one story makes us believe that. It's a collection, like you said, of so many different stories, of values, of maybe experiences that we have, but we are selective in our minds.
So do you think stories influence us with that, like have that impact on us, or is it the culture or our backgrounds, or
Yeah.
since we're kids and stuff like that, or is it the stories what we see, what we watch?
I think it's a collection of all of it. And I think what we're exposed to when we're kids, how do we learn when we're kids? It's through stories, right? So at the end of the day, it's what we can use to support that narrative. And because our mind is
But it's more powerful, story or a narrative?
I think the narrative is far more powerful because you will find the story to support your narrative.
But stories are the way to empower the narrative. Means through stories only people actually get the narrative.
Yeah, you can. I mean, absolutely, right? But the thing is with storytelling, and this is the thing with narrative science, is that people hold on to that narrative and they will find reasons not to change it. Right? Like you will find it. Like, I mean, you can talk to somebody and you can be like, well, actually, what about this? And I'll give you an example. When Brexit happened, right? And still happening, when the never-ending saga of Brexit is happening from the UK. What's his name? Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, right? They were some of the leading champions against the movement to leave Britain. They were championing for people to leave. One of their key notes was they built this narrative around what Britain needed. It needed to keep its money in Britain, right? So they had these huge billboards about $450 million pounds, 923 million pounds were being given to the EU just for like membership costs, and we can keep that and we can give that to our hospitals in Britain, and we can give it to the NHS. That is complete, like it was a lie, right? It was a fabrication, but it was a really strong narrative because it played into people's belief in Britain that we're losing out, right? That we are catering to the EU and not catering to our own people. It's a very old narrative, right? Our people over the outsider.
But it can
And
not be a fact, but it's just one of the many facts which it doesn't really paint the real good picture. We probably would be gaining more than what they were losing.
yeah, but it's actually proven to be not true, right? Like, it's like,
The maths
yeah, he's actually himself who said it.
doesn't add up.
The math doesn't add up, and he knew it. And he, like, he very blatant. Yeah, it let it run its course. But that's what happens, I think, when you really build a powerful narrative and you allow yourself to buy into it. You will fight to change it. You will fight not to change it. You selectively, pick the things that you want. Can you think about any other examples that are like, well, people will stick to this thing, even though they feel like actually there's a ton of evidence to show that it's not real. Yeah. Exactly. Every single thing he's doing, he just lies all the time. And it doesn't matter because he's created a really strong narrative around him. And the people who follow those people, it doesn't matter to them. Because they're supporting that person. They're not supporting that person as per se or the policies. They're supporting that story of that overarching narrative that this is the kind of person that I am. This is my identity, and this is the way of my world, and this is how I want to engage in the world. Right? I don't like that immigrants are coming into our country. I don't like that women are not staying at home taking care of the kids anymore. That's different from what I knew when I was growing up. It's wrong. That's, they feed into that. And you can show a ton of science around it, how things are actually a lot better. Immigrants are great and wonderful. Like, it doesn't matter to some people. So in some ways, I think for me, narrative is powerful, more powerful than story. And the way you break that narrative is by good, effective storytelling. It's by good methods. Or good campaigning, right? Or like you build a different story. I have this book here. How many of you are familiar with it or seen it? So do you know the story of these two women? Do you? So the two women who wanted to start this, it's called Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls. And it's a collection of really, really cool women throughout history and in our contemporary world that have made enormous change and do really amazing things that nobody has ever heard of. Like, that is the sad part, is that most of us, while we're growing up, don't hear about female leaders, about female inventors, about female writers. Most of the people we're exposed to are not women who do that work. And so these two women wanted to create better stories for their daughters, to inspire them. And they started a GoFundMe, a Kickstarter page. They said, we want to do some stories for young girls who are really, about inspiring heroes for women. And they asked for $25,000. They raised 250 grand. And they came up with this. Now it's in its second volume, and now there's a book called a book for Boys Who Dare to Be Different. But it's about changing the narrative, right? This is a really good example of when you can put something together that challenges the narrative we've all been given as kids, that actually most of the people who do this really cool stuff are guys. Most of the writers that I can think of are guys. Most of the poets I think of are guys. I mean, that's what we learn. And this is, I think, a good example of flipping that narrative. So I think it's quite powerful. I think it also speaks to power and privilege. I think we have to ask ourselves the simple question: who is writing stories? Who has the power to write and tell stories?
People with free time.
And lots of coffee. Exactly. Right? Historical narrative is so powerful. What do you think of when you think of Genghis Khan?
Genghis Khan.
He was like, people talk about him as this barbarian, he was this and he was that. What do you think of when you think of Alexander the Great? And they essentially do the same thing, right? Like conquerors, they do the same thing. But we paint one person in one way, another person another way. So
That's bad because I didn't get it. Genghis is good or bad?
I think Genghis Khan is usually painted as being negative. Yeah. something. I don't know. Climate change is a great example. Oh my God, the climate change.
Oh, they changed the name
Deniers.
from global warming to climate change. Right?
Yeah, and now climate crisis, because I think they were like, change is too subtle a term, so we should change it to climate crisis. Just devastation. So I think narrative is important. The third piece that we use, so we've got methods, we've got narrative. The third piece that we use is purpose. What is your goal? If you want to think about a narrative, you want to think about doing a method of storytelling, you want to write poetry, what is your purpose for it? What do you want to achieve, right? Like, what is your goal for it? I think you have to be very thoughtful and very clear about what that outcome will be. You can decide that that outcome is actually just to make people reflect and think. That's fine. But you have to know what that outcome is, I think, because that informs everything. Right?
Can you give an example to differentiate between the narrative and the purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. So my purpose, for example, and I got like a couple of case studies. We go through like this little presentation. So when we talk about, we've talked about sort of covered about some of the why stories. There's storytelling, there's narrative, and there's purpose. So your purpose is your goal around, say for example, I want to change an attitude, right? I want people to believe that the gender pay gap is a negative thing. So then you have to first, I think, determine what the narrative is around the gender pay. Why are women paid less? What drives that? Why do people believe that that's a good way of allocating finances in their companies or in their governments? That is your narrative that you're trying to figure out. So once you've determined your purpose and your outcome is like, well, actually, this is the thing I want to change. Then your narrative is kind of the research around that thing. What is the ecosystem in which that thing lives, right? What is the grand narrative? And then your method is informed by how is best to change it. So if you think, I want to change I want to achieve better pay parity, or I want to close the gender gap. Your narrative is all of the research that you're going to put into it. Well, why does it exist? What is the story? Like, what is that? Why do people do it, right? What drives this? Even in 2019, when there's so much talk about empowerment and feminism and social justice, why does it still exist? And then your method will be focused on, will be informed by that. So if you feel that in the particular company that you're working with, it exists because most of the leadership believe that the women that work for them are going to go on maternity leave, and that's why they need to retain more men because they're losing time. I mean, that's one of the reasons why a lot of the pay gap was there, right? It's because of all these things that women are going to leave. And so then what your method might be is to interview the employees in your company, interview the female employees in your company, and talk about impact that the female employees have done. Maybe your method is to create an anthology of how the women in your company have invested their time in you. And then pose the question of, is this not valuable? Or how is this any different, right, from what men might do? I mean, this is just an example I'm thinking about the top of my head, but that's the model, right, by which you want to kind of go in.
Question all the time.
Yes. I think it's very critical to question and challenge all the time. Yeah.
It's actually
It's
interesting.
a good way. I was saying that it's a good way to telling your story, challenging people and challenging their narratives and questioning. Because we usually we are lazy to questioning and all. It's easy to accept a narrative and hold it.
Yeah.
So basically it's all about the research. So what's gonna make a good story, or what's gonna make the story powerful is the research we do about this story, or about the method we're gonna use, right?
Yeah, I think it's research, but then it's also a lot of engagement. And so let me kind of go back to the structure here. So when I think about, So if this is the model that we're working with, method, narrative, and purpose, because those are the three elements that we like to talk. Let's flip that. Purpose first, right? Always determine your goals first. So I begin with, what are some planning exercises? What are some conversations that we can have to determine what our goals are or what our outcomes are? And I think that has to be really clear. It happens through a lot of like talking, a lot of brainstorming. I have loads and loads of conversations. And it has to happen with diverse stakeholders, right? Because usually what companies or organizations or schools or anybody are looking for is to do something that's meaningful, and they have diverse stakeholders. So you kind of have to include a lot of diverse voices. I think in that process, you're determining the purpose, right? So that's your purpose base. Secondly, when you think about the narrative, now if you've got your purpose, you think about the narrative and you're like, okay, well, what is the ecosystem that we're living in? What is that? I like to have, so some very tangible ways of doing that is like you can have advisory councils or advisory like working groups or committees that are representative of the different stakeholders and the diverse voices that you want on the table, because they're going to tell you what they live in, right? What their reality is. You have as well a lot of the external research. But I think the closer you keep it to the ground, the better. You have to find out who your audience is, right? The thing that you're trying to change, now for example in the gender pay gap situation, your audience is leadership and decision makers, right? But everybody who's involved in that are the stakeholders in and around your company. They could also be your partners, because maybe you have, as a company, people are going to look at you badly if you don't have gender positive policies. So it's also your reputation. So you might want to consider who else needs to be at the table, right? Like, what do other people think of you? What is the narrative about you that your partners have? There's a lot to consider around that piece, and that's the research. I feel like the narrative is really the research, and it also then questions the power, right? Who has that decision-making power? Who are they? What's the narrative they live in, right? You want to kind of bring all of that stuff together, and then you determine your method. So sometimes I'll go and I'll talk to people, I'll talk to clients or organizations about projects, and they're like, I want to do a video. And I'm like, okay, well, why? Why do you want to do a video? What is that, what will be the purpose? And they're like, well, I've got this thing and I need to share it. And I find that people start with method oftentimes, and then they work backwards, whereas for me, that seems counterintuitive, because I think you should start with your purpose and move the other way. And it might be that your method is actually something that you didn't think it was going to be, but you have to leave yourself open to that. I think that's what art is. I think that's what storytelling is. It's a lot of openness and uncertainty. And you might start something not knowing where it's going to end, but you should have a purpose in mind.
If the story is good, shouldn't it not matter what the method is?
Maybe, but sometimes it's inaccessible, right? So say your population, so I did a project with a lot of street involved and homeless youth, and they don't have access to written material as much, right? Or they're not going to have access to laptops and devices. So the method is sometimes very crucial, because you want that method requires face-to-face, and it requires more interaction with service providers who they're engaging with, versus like, here, let's give you a cool app. And I think sometimes the method gets away, we chase after the method, and sometimes things get exciting for us. I'm like, I want an explainer video, and people talk about that, or like, I want, I want infographics, and they're really good ways to use all of these tools. They just have to be matched appropriately, right? Every tool has a purpose. Even the most boring research report, like, you could make it interesting, but it has a purpose. And it has an audience. You have to match it, I think.
So the method is the way we tell the story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think
Yeah.
one should believe in the narrative? Because there are two concepts I'm just thinking. There is narrative, there is purpose. If you think of purpose first, then you can build a narrative which you don't believe in, or which you are trying to build it for somebody else.
Yeah.
Then you have a narrative which you really believe in, and then you have to find a purpose to make the story happen. So in both the cases, I'm just thinking, if purpose comes first,
Yeah.
then the narrative may or may not be aligned to your, ideologies or your ethics.
Yeah.
But in the other way around, if you are driven more from the narrative side and then build a purpose around it in order to then make a method and a story, that is another way to build stories. So these are two probably parallel concepts with two different purposes.
Yeah, that's such an excellent question. I'm actually really happy you asked that and you've opened that door, because it's absolutely true. When you have a purpose, and I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of power. Say my purpose is to start a war, right? And then I'm like, what is the best narrative that I can build in order to start a war? If my purpose is to build a wall, what's the best narrative that I can use to build that wall? And I mean, I think corporations do this a lot, right? Like there's a really famous product called Fair and Lovely in India. There's similar products all around the world like that.
Can you explain the purpose?
Sorry?
That was the narrative in Asia, right? Very lovely.
Yes.
Because most of Asian countries believe that narrative.
Absolutely.
Same cosmetic brands, they sell other products in the West to make them darker.
Yeah, I know, like the tanning product. Absolutely. It's, yeah, and that's a company that's just trying to sell a product who's created this narrative.
Yeah, same company with different products.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly it. You're going to just create the narrative that has nothing to do with your ideology. It's what is that purpose. Your purpose doesn't have to be ethical. Your purpose doesn't have to be altruistic. Oftentimes it's not. And especially around corporations, it's not. Sorry? It's definitely it's like someone else's purpose. But in that narrative, your narrative is destroying self-esteem, right? Like it's a very deliberate and powerful way to actually destroy self-esteem, and it makes millions of dollars. It's $1 billion industry. I don't even know how many millions and billions it's like, but it's very, very it's successful. Body image and self-esteem, that whole narrative around what is more beautiful than something else is a very successful narrative. I think the narrative around language, if you speak English and you speak in a particular accent, maybe you deserve an ear more than if you don't. And I mean, there's a lot of studies been done in Canada around when you have a certain, if you have different kinds of accents and the different ways that service providers will respond to those accents. So if you're, no, it's true. Yeah. If you're a healthcare, in healthcare and education and whatnot, if you have, what's the best accent? British accent. Yeah. I mean, and I would say, let's contextualize best, but the most desirable accent. In that,
Where do I get the biggest pizza?
in the language of English, of course, yeah. And
What's the worst? No, what's the worst?
I mean, it's not. I don't know. I think the Indian accents are the Bangladeshi accents. I mean, some of the Asian accents, yeah. I mean, it depends. I think when you're looking at that hierarchy, it might be not as specific, but the accents definitely have a hierarchy of attention, right?
Yeah. Now you know why all calls get monitored and recorded.
I mean, it's also just racism, right? Like this is just racist. Yeah, and they're racist narratives along that. I mean, there was. I should check this, and I really maybe shouldn't talk about it, but there was this thing floating around about the kinds of things that were considered disorders, like health-based disorders from the 1800s, and some of them are really hilarious. And there was for women, hysteria was one, but I think people still consider hysteria. There was the urge not to do housework, which is considered a mental health issue. The urge not to do housework. Yes, because it didn't fit into the narrative of what people thought women found enjoyment of, right? They were like, what do you mean? You have a home and you have a family and you don't want to do housework? Something must be wrong with you. So, let's, I love your face right now. And again, I need to fact check this because this was totally one of those things that was trolling around, but I find it pretty believable. Maybe that's my narrative where I'm like, I would believe it. Yeah? Okay, so I think, that it doesn't, going back to your question, it's not always ethical, and it's a very important thing, and that's why I feel like it's powerful. Because you have to ask yourself the question of, when you think about the purpose, you have to think about what are you furthering in that, right? And the only person who can make that decision is you. Like, you can say, it doesn't fit with my ideology, I'm not going to do this. Yeah, or, like, I don't know. You can't, some people, everybody's circumstance is different, right? And I can't tell somebody what choices they make. I don't think also that's the point of art and storytelling. I think that it's the reflection and thought. And I think it's making the small decisions that you can make every day to make something better. Even that, I think, is strong. But yeah, if somebody at Fair and Lovely want to give me a job and say, like, make a storytelling approach for us, I would probably say no. I would most definitely say no. And a lot of corporations do that, right? They do CSR work, they do corporate social responsibility work, and they want to develop stronger narratives. And they're like, actually, no. Yes. I also want to point out that I think within stories and data, like in terms of the methods, sometimes there's a tendency to find, to make those two things conflict. And you're saying you either have factual data or you have stories. I don't think that's ever the case. Good storytelling is actually a mix of both of those things. I think you need to complement your stories with evidence. And you need to know the research. You need to have some sort of data point. Whether it's about the human condition or whether it's about some sort of study that you've done, you need to make it sort of what some literary people will say universally. I think Aristotle actually would say universal events. And I think that matters. But you can do that with data.
And statistics.
Yeah. At the end of the day, you have to determine for yourself, right? Again, like where you will draw the line in terms of what you will further and what you won't. But I think that's an important piece to be aware of in storytelling.
With the same data, you can tell multiple stories which can themselves conflict.
Yeah.
So in that sense, while we're telling stories, as a listener, how can we be a better listener in understanding stories?
Yeah, exactly. Have you just seen this presentation before? I think that that's exactly one of the things is around listening, and how we need to be active story listeners in order to be active storytellers. That's a very, very important.
Again, in Turkey, there was a storyteller who is French, Liberman, maybe you know her. She's famous, and her book is bestseller in Turkey now. She already learned Turkish, and she's always talking about the stories, like for the old people, like old people stories. And when I joined her workshop, she said that if you are telling your story, you should make people to use 5 senses.
Five senses.
5 senses. For example.
Senses.
5 senses.
Yeah.
5 senses. It's like if you are, for example, if I'm talking about, like, I should say, like, talking about the garden, for example, I should say there was a tomato. It was really tasty. But I touched it. It was like, it was not so soft, but something like that. And you start imagining, like, with your tongue, with your ear, with your hand, like you are imagining that you are using all of your senses. And she said that it makes people get more focused to your story, she said.
Absolutely. I think that goes back to some of the science, right? The neuroscience about the kind of language that we use. If we're talking about certain verbs and senses, it actually fires up those sensory cortexes in our brain, and it makes it more memorable. It's like you're walking somebody through the journey of eating this tomato, or picking it, or tasting it, or touching it, and it's a very good way to integrate language around storytelling, I think. In terms of the model, I was thinking I can share a case example, and I want you guys to tell me what works for you, what you find useful. I like some of the discussion. I love the questions. If you have more of them, if you want to stay on one part and discuss one piece of something more, just let me know. I'm thinking I can walk you through a case example of one of the projects that we've done. So you can see maybe how some of it has, taken shape. So one of the really cool projects that I've absolutely loved working on is with the Women in HIV/AIDS initiative in Ontario, in Canada. It's a strategy group that's based all across the province of Ontario and 13 different sites. So they have 13 different centers in different locations, and they have diversely, populated areas. Like it's a diverse population that they work with. There's local women, as in rural women, urban women, women of different ethnicities, language, backgrounds, age, all of that. And they wanted to develop something that was a collaborative art project that could allow the women in these different sites to come together around some sort of commonality or understand each other's experiences around sexual health. So their goal was to do sexual health work with the female participants in their communities, and they were thinking about what can we do to bring all of this together. So we talked about art, and so I met with, since this was the purpose-driven part of it, right? Like, what is the goal? You want to develop something that will bring these women they will allow these women to engage in the 13 centers that you have. It will allow them to share some of their realities, some of their ideas, and be active participants in the work. And you want them to be able to feel connected to the women across the province, not just in their local regions. So that was the purpose. Then we thought, okay, how can we do this? So we brainstormed and we came up with a few different ideas. The thing that we went with is taking a fable that would be recognizable and that people feel familiar with, and building a fable is like a folk tale. A fable is like, like in Aesop's fables. Fables often mean they have a moral story. They use animals as characters. So the example that we use is the crow and the pitcher. Have you heard of this story?
The crow and the pitcher?
Yeah. So it's a story about a crow. It's a hot day, and this crow is very thirsty. It's flying around looking for water, and it finds a pitcher of water on the ground. So it sees this pitcher of water, it flies down, but the water is too low in the pitcher. So it's putting its beak in, it's not getting the water, and it's very sad. And it's thinking about, what can I do? So it sees some rocks. This crow is looking at these little pebbles or rocks. It takes these pebbles and they're putting it in the pitcher, and because of that, the water level rises. When the water level rises, it can drink. So, the idea is that it's about being resourceful. It's about understanding your environment, being observant, being a hero, a change agent.
He's good at critical thinking.
Yes, exactly. This is a really smart crow. And so we took that story and we created a framework around that story. So we assigned different representations to the different elements in the story. So we created a big giant storyboard where the pitcher of water is the challenge, the crow is the agent of change, the water is the solution, the rocks are the solution, and the water is the change. And so we labeled all of this.
Wow.
And we created the framework, the storyboard, and then we brought all of these coordinators from these 13 sites together. We did a training session with them. They had great ideas. They were like, you know what, we don't just want to bring our the women in our communities to come and talk about this. Let them do it. And I was like, what does that mean, right? They're like, we're going to do an installation. They can actually make their own rocks. I was like, what? That's awesome. So some of the sites created installations of the pitcher of water. They used a jar, they used rocks, they actually marked on the rocks. You can see one of the images in the presentation is the rocks that came out of it. And so they labeled these rocks with the different solutions that they had. Well, I want to make, I think love and activism and self-care are important solutions for me. So the idea was, how do you achieve sexual health? How do you make that better for yourself? And so the crow is the women themselves. They were like, so we asked the first prompt was, who is the agent of change in this story? And by and large, the women said themselves, which itself is so amazing. It was not their service providers, it was not their doctors, it was not others, it was themselves. And they talked about what they needed to be better agents of change, right? So they became very active in this story. They were taking ownership in this story. They were not passive recipients of service. The second agent of change they talked about was their service providers and the organizations. Were like, secondly, we need them to create a better environment for us that's enabling and that's supportive. And thirdly, we need institutions and organizations to have better policies, to have better funding, and to have better service access. And we were like, these are, ideas that are coming from on the ground. They're not driven by research. They're driven by community engagement because of the story that we were allowed to share with them that they could use as a framework. So they labeled these rocks, they talked about the pitcher of water, they talked about all of this, and that was the implementation part, right? That's the narrative. We found out what is this narrative that's driving these women, and the narrative was that we are actually not active players in the way of our health. When we go to the doctors, they're not asking us what we want, they're telling us what we should do. That was their narrative. So we're like, let's flip that. You tell us what you want. You're the expert in your health. And that, I think, was a powerful way of changing it. And then the tool became the story. The story and this framework was the tool and the method. So it was fables, it was adapting that fable.
Really cool idea, really.
Thank you.
You guys changed it. It's really cool. And what happened?
It was amazing. We had so the outcomes were they were multi-pronged. We had the data, actually we had the stories that came forward from the women themselves and all the labeling and all of the discussions that they shared. We transcribed it and we thematically arranged it to come up with the main things that people talked about. So what were some of the key themes that came across? And that allowed us to go back to our purpose. So the key themes that came across the board is women wanted to be their own agents of change. And women saw that the challenges were often very common across the 13 sites. So one of our purposes was to allow women to feel more connected with other women around the province, and they were able to do that because of what they saw coming out of these different sessions. So a woman in Sudbury, I'm sort of more with Ontario's geography, but a woman in Toronto and then miles and miles away, a woman in Sudbury and miles away, a woman in Thunder Bay could see that actually what I'm going through is kind of similar to what this other woman is going through, and I don't have to be alone in that, right? I don't have to be isolated in that. It's not just my experience. And so that connectivity, okay, good, we got that purpose, right? They felt that. The other part was, what can we do to kind of understand what women are looking for? And through all of their, we had a ton of inputs. That was not our problem. They were ready to give us a ton of inputs. And then we made recommendations out of those inputs. And we brought a bunch of service providers together in a learning forum and said, this is what women are looking for. And this is what the recommendations are. They want these kinds of programs, they want these kinds of services, they want this kind of framework. And this was their narrative journey. That was kind of like a full circle. And then we did an evaluation. So we went back to the women who shared in the different sites, and we created this publication, this resource. We gave it back to them. They were super amazed and touched. We created a poster that they could put on the walls of their organizations to show visibility of their experience, which really, I think, went back to support them taking that ownership, And I think that this is part when you do, all of these concepts are tied in, right? Co-design, participation, community engagement, art, storytelling. When you do those sorts of things, you have to come back to the participant. You can't just treat them as ways to extract information and then, go and talk about with policymakers and governments. You bring it back to people and say, this is, what's come out of it. What do you guys think? Does it fit? And when it does, then it's like even more powerful, right? Because they are also getting sort of this journey along with that, and we are too.
Well,
yeah.
Would you say that presenting this as a game, like we're going to do an art installation, free the women to be more creative and collaborate more?
Would I say it's a what? Sorry?
Like creating this kind of game, like we're going to do an art installation, right?
Yeah.
But the outcome was more like putting together the demands.
Yeah. But I think this is where the method it's important for your method to be very aligned with your narrative and your purpose, because when you're thinking only of the method, you end up doing things that are more, okay, let's think about this as a fun way to interact with each other and come up with something. And when you put it in a model that's larger, where you have a narrative and a purpose, then you're actually bringing something transformative to the table, right? Like then the whole process, it becomes about a process. And it becomes a transformative one. It's not a session where people come and they create something that's art-based, or they're telling a story and then they go away. I think good storytelling has to be transformative. Transformative. You know, it has to go through some change. You should be going through something. Not to say that the one-off sessions are not, don't have a purpose, they do. But in this situation, I think their purpose was a little bit more expansive and a little bit more, you know, they required that deeper connection, right? So we did an evaluation at the end of it too. I am a very firm believer in evaluation, as you should always be learning about how to make something better. And the evaluation was really positive. So they've now taken, in the second year, they've taken it one step further and are doing something to build on this Women Are Changemakers. So we titled the project Women Are Changemakers. And they're now building on Women Are Changemakers and doing something on their own through that. Which is, you know, like it was such a hard project for us. We loved it. We loved working on every part of it because people were coming together in a very open, honest, authentic way, right? So yes, that's one example. One of the things I would like to talk about though in terms of power and privilege, I mentioned that in here, is that narrative allows you to check your power. So we assigned these labels, right, in the story. We were like, okay, the pitcher of water is going to be the challenge, the crow is going to be the agent of change, and the rocks are going to be the solutions. And when we sent it to the women came back, they actually talked about the water as well, which we hadn't assigned anything to. But they talked about the water and they said, well, what is the water? The water should be change. What do we mean by change? And honestly, the planning team didn't think about that as much, because in our minds, you know, change is, like, we're like, okay, our lives are good. This is the change, right? That like, we're considering that you should be thinking about change. But that was our power and privilege not being checked in that moment, where we're like, we're not thinking about what that change means because we're kind of happy in our lives. But when you want something to change, that's when you're actually trying to define it. And I think that was actually a really powerful takeaway for us. And in art-based projects and in storytelling projects, you're giving away power. You know, I think inherently, it means that you are you're sharing the power that you might have to build a narrative or to tell a story with people around you. But that comes back to ethics. You can either do that or you can make a decision not to.
You're saying that organizations that don't let employees participate in the narrative, that's not.
I don't think that's actually even, I think it actually adds to detriment to an organization. One of the biggest things around building organizational narrative is your strategic vision, right? Like what you are deciding to do as a company, what is your vision? What do you want to change in the world? Every good company has to have a clear strategic vision, and an employee needs to buy into that, right? Like that's part of a narrative. They need to see themselves in the narrative of what they're trying to achieve with their work in this company. If they can't see that, if they're divorced from that process, they're not going to be putting, I mean, you know, you're not going to get as much investment and as much, I think, from your employees than they would if they believe in it. I think that's just my experience, and I think employee engagement is actually a really good example of needing to use organizational narrative. But that's one case. So we've got those are the great kinds of projects that I like doing. So you have these like really creative, engaging projects. And like I said, sometimes you write a report, sometimes you develop a toolkit, sometimes you develop a website. In all of those methods, you have some level of a story, some level of a narrative, and some level of a purpose. And in each situation, it should be very tailored and it should be very customized. I don't think there's one size fits all in any of these things.
One question. So there are multiple stories and multiple methods in which a story can be conveyed, depending on the narrative and the purpose. Who and how do you decide what's the best way, or which one do you choose from? As a person, if you're doing that, what kind of a title you hold in the organization?
Yeah. I mean, it depends. I know. I think that you're speaking to power, right? Like, who has the power to make that decision? Yeah. And I think it should be done collaboratively. I think that's where you should be bringing collective voices to the table, building access, and trying to do that. But ultimately, you're right. Somebody might have that decision. And maybe sometimes the person a good leader, I think, would go with the decision that's a collective decision versus maybe something that's their own preference, even if you don't like it.
In your case, in your story that you just mentioned, how did you arrive at the method?
So we have, there's a team that I sometimes work with. So I work with independent consultants and contractors, whatnot, illustrators, artists. So there's the core team is myself and a researcher who does a lot of arts-based research, and a woman who does a lot of community work and editing. So we, along with two other women who run this project and run this strategy, talked about different ways in which we could try and do that. We brainstormed first as a consulting team, and then we pitched 3 different ways of doing it. So the Pitcher and the Crow was one idea. The other 2 were different. They really liked the idea of a fable, and so then we honed that down even more, and then we even gave them 2 different options of 2 fables that they could use.
I would never have thought that this would work.
But you know what? It's work. It's a lot of back and forth, and you have to have the patience for it. Like sometimes I find like you need planning. You need to give yourself time to plan, because then what they did is use the coordinators in the 13 sites. They did a call out within those coordinators and said if everybody can, if anybody who's interested can join an advisory committee to help us make decisions about this method and this artwork, collaborative art project. So about 5 of them were interested. Then our pitched ideas went to that advisory committee. They solicited responses from them and consulted with them. Then it went through the strategy heads, and then it went back to us. So it was a lot of consultation.
That's a lot of hard work. For a story, like you play a story and it takes you like a long time to get this story right.
It does because it's good.
Like I'm a big fan of Pixar movies. I'm a character designer. I do characters and stuff.
Amazing.
So I like Pixar movies. The way they tell the story, it's the best story you could ever tell.
Yeah.
They make this small idea. It's just very simple idea, and they make a huge story out of it. It's amazing. And sometimes it takes them like 5 to 7 years to write the story, to get the story right.
Yeah.
To develop the story, it's a long time.
It's a long time, but look at the impact, right, that it has. I think the more effort and time you put into it, the stronger the impact. And the more people that you engage, I think, to come on board in that process. Invite people in. I think that's a really important thing. Just invite people in. It's something you have to do collaboratively, I feel.
How long was the time frame of this story?
1 year. So as we started in the fall with our first meeting over like coffee, we're like, let's think about something to do. And that evolved and evolved and evolved, and like I think the next summer we had the publication. Yeah, and then in year 2, sorry. Yeah, we once we developed the framework, we created an implementation guide. So the guide allowed the heads of the organization, so the directors, along with the site coordinators, to think about how they can implement it step by step. When they felt that it was doable, then we knew we were ready. So they were like, okay, I can actually take this. Then they had questions. They're like, how do I adapt it? They're like, you adapt it how you want. So like I said, some of them used installations, some of them actually wrote, some of them did drawing work. It was quite diverse because they adapted it to their own needs, Some of them actually did individual meetings with women and said, let's think about this story, and others did it in a group setting. Some people had an event, and people just came to a table and did it. So it's quite, yeah.
So either, let's say, so if you have a narrative which everyone appears to, right?
Yeah.
You might change that narrative.
Yeah.
How important is repetition to you? I mean, does that happen in the illustration? Like basically reinforcing the same idea in different ways. Does that really have an impact, or does having the same pattern repeat make more sense? Do you approach it? What makes?
Can you repeat the question for the audience?
Sorry?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is, what do we think about repetition? Is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is it effective to have a repetitive message to challenge a narrative? So if we want to challenge the narrative, let's go back to our sample gender pay gap. And we have a message that actually no, women are valuable in your company. They've actually worked this, and this. Look at the evidence. We've got the stories. They've written it out. Does it make sense to just keep repeating that message until we see change? Is that similar? Is kind of what you're talking about? A change in narrative?
Gender pay gap.
Yeah.
What's the narrative here? Because I know this guy, Jordan B. Peterson,
Oh, yeah.
who challenges all the. What's your opinion about that?
So, I mean, in that sense, right? Like, so if you're talking within a company and the narrative within the leadership is that, well, you know, they have a very like archaic narrative about women and their contributions, and you want to change that. The repetition might work. I think if you constantly feel like you're coming across challenges with that, maybe you want to change your method, right? Like, isn't it like Einstein who said that you're doing the same thing over and over again and seeing the same result is insanity? It's like the definition of insanity.
Repetition can be like conveying the same idea using different stories. Basically,
Could be.
You're building so many stories, but they convey the same idea, just reinforcing the idea of the person.
Yeah.
That's one way to be repetitive without the same story, I guess.
Yeah, I think you have to think about it maybe from different angles. Like, it might not only be, and this is a good example of maybe when you want to converge your stories with some sort of data, right? Let's look at what the evidence says. So say if you want to, now you've collected these stories from the women and the female employees in your company and you talk about how valuable they really are. It's not going anywhere. You're still trying to challenge that narrative with the leadership. You're saying, no, this makes sense. Now you pack on top of that. You're like, well, actually, it's now government policy. You know, it shouldn't be, like, even the governments realize the value of this. Like, it makes no sense. Then you've packed on policy evidence. Then maybe you want to pack down some evidence from, you know, what are your partners doing, right? Are the company's competitors doing better because they have better gender equity policies? What have their experiences been? What kind of employees have they attracted because they've been able to create a narrative about being better in terms of the gender equity space or being leaders in gender equity? Does that help the company? You're creating, I think you have to create different reasons. I mean, think about it almost even like as an essay sometimes, right? You have got different arguments to achieve the outcome you want to achieve. One of the tools in which you can argue is through story and through art. One of the tools in which you can argue is through data and evidence. One of the tools is maybe through other experiences. Look what somebody else has done, comparable company there. You know, I think in a way it's probably repetition because your ultimate message is still the same. You know, your ultimate message is still the same. Change your policy, right? Pay people equally. Have a transparent pay scale. Maybe those are your outcomes. That doesn't change. But the way in which you go about it can be complementary and, you know, really supporting that ultimate goal, right? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question, or you're kind of like, not so?
No, I was trying to apply what you're saying. Like, so basically, if you look at ad campaigns, they target different people differently, but they're for the same narrative. Right? So they're interesting. No, it's just resonating. I'm just trying
Yeah.
because there's something about if you say something loud enough, often enough, long enough, it becomes the truth regardless of what the reality may be. So I was just trying to.
Yeah. In some cases.
But that also means that anybody who has the right tools with them can bring the change in the direction that they want to, which is fine.
Yeah.
And which also means that if we are happy in our own space and nobody is doing anything about it, somebody who wants to bring a change can do that with the knowledge and ideas and tools that we have now, which is good. So change is inevitable as long as it's happening in the right direction as you want it.
Exactly. Change is inevitable. That's the only thing we can be certain of, right, is change. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's our historical experience is of that, is how people, everyday people, because they've decided to do something differently or to sort of challenge a narrative that they've been given, make change happen, right? A lot of trailblazers have done that. I'm going to change the way we think about education. I'm going to change the way we think about science. I'm going to change the way we think about money. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like, and then there are other people who will hold on to it till, you know, that's not going to change what they think, right? There's always be a certain amount of population that will just stick to that narrative.
How to start storytelling?
How do you start it? I think you start by first, I mean, it depends on your context, right? And what I'd like to put that question out to you guys in terms of like, what do you feel like in your lives, in your context, what do you feel is the purpose of the storytelling? Like why are you interested in storytelling? I mean, I know from your profession, you talked about it a little bit. Yeah.
For me, I want to bring a change in my organization, and there is a narrative. So the narrative is that even if tech guys are doing a lot of activity, for business, it doesn't make much sense. So we want to bring a change in narrative that tech is actually supporting the product and or the organization.
Yeah.
So generally, if the narrative is that business sales is going, because all the other department can actually show that we are achieving this and that, but tech can't. Tech is just a support for all the other. So just give me an example.
You know what would be really interesting? I mean, it makes me think about, have you guys ever seen this documentary, which is like, I think it's called Gone for a Day, something like that? I can't remember now, don't quote me on that. Maybe it's not that name at all. But it's a documentary about how, so in California, I think there were, or maybe not California, Florida, or in one of the states in the United States, they talked a lot about, you know, I don't like the term illegal immigrants, but like people who are there not on legal visas and whatnot, and they're just, you know, like on, like they're not doing anything, or they're just like mooching off welfare, whatever they think that the narrative is, right? And so they had this documentary where they said Gone for a Day, and it was like half sci-fi, like a bunch of people wake up and there's nobody to do the kind of work that a lot of the illegal immigrants actually do every day. So there was nobody in terms of seasonal migrant labor, there was nobody in terms of like the janitorial staff. Oftentimes it's like the backbone to a lot of the way things run is gone. It would be interesting, I mean, if you think that, like, you know, if your narrative is around, we're supporting all this other work so you guys can go ahead and do what you need to do, but we're not getting that same kind of recognition, think about how it would be if you were gone for a day. Or think about the next time you wanted something to happen with tech and you weren't able to do it. Maybe that's like a, you know, a counter narrative, right? A counter story. I mean, this is just, so also you work for my husband's company, so like.
Gone for a Day would be a narrative or a story?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, so the documentary is the tool and the method. Your story is what you, like, so it's the story of people gone for the day. The counter narrative is that, can you imagine if you didn't have this in your life? So you break it down in that way. But sorry, oh, you know, I'm dating myself here, but this is probably 12 years ago. I guess it is pre-Netflix.
So I have another question. So it's actually feeding off of that. So if you have a narrative,
Yeah.
you're not a storyteller.
Okay.
So what I've seen on occasion is that if you're not a storyteller, fine. Let them tell your story. It'll be a lot more powerful than if you tell a story. But at the same time, I don't know if that's very effective, because there's a danger that I'll ask her maybe to tell my story and it comes out or not what I'm expecting. So you'll be like, oh, you know what? Tech are very important. And then you tell this guy and he's like, we don't need tech. I mean, you could just turn it around. So you don't have a control on the story. So how do you control?
And you're like, okay, bye.
Yeah, so how do you control the narrative of the story itself? So because when you were doing that project in Canada, obviously it turned out there's always the danger that the narrative can completely switch.
Yeah.
Is there any way to monitor or control that? What do you do?
I think there's a couple of parts to your question. So one is like, is it wise or advisable to have somebody else tell your story who might have the tools? You know, yeah. Yeah, exactly. To be honest, I kind of disagree. I think it's collaborative effort. If you want to bring other people into that process, you have to be there every step of the way because you are the one who owns that story, right? Even if you're asking somebody else to tell it, you don't you don't hand it off, right? You have to sit with them and you build that together, you build your tools together, you critique it together, you share it with other people who might share your story. So like you were saying in your example, you're like, yeah, we tech guys are not getting our due. And you can maybe approach somebody and you're like, you know what, I need you to tell this story. You're a great storyteller, you've done this, this and this. What do you think? And then you guys sit and talk. You actually should be taking that back to your tech team and being like, what do you guys think? Like it should be, it can't even just be the one, right? It should be as many people. Again, invite people in to your process.
I think you're right. You can outsource anything and everything.
Yeah.
For technology, it's easy. You know what to expect. But storytelling is more of an art, I guess. You may not get what you really wanted. You may probably get better.
Yeah.
But that's always possible.
Yeah.
Are you saying storytelling is a core thing that should not be outsourced?
No, I wouldn't say that because if you're not good at it, you probably outsource it to somebody who is better at it as long as they convey the same idea.
Yeah. And again, you're aware of power. As a storyteller, if somebody's coming to you and being like, you know what, I want you to carve my narrative, I want you to make it happen, I want you to make it effective, how do I best tell this story? And I can sit there and be like, oh yeah, this sounds great, this would be really cool, I think this is great. But then I'm doing you a disservice if I'm not involving you around that process and not asking you for collective ownership. And you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not demanding that. And I think that's where you're sharing power, right? And I think we have too many examples, anthropologically, academically, in entertainment, of people going in and taking stories and making it their own. You do filmmakers do this. Writers do this, academics do this, researchers do this. They'll go, they observe, they pick someone else's story, they make it shiny and happy and market it and sell it, get rich or get credit, and that none of that filters back down to people who own those stories. So I think we have to be very aware of the power and the privilege that we might hold if we have those methods at our disposal. Of being made aware of time and so I wanted to kind of end a little bit on, if you kind of go back to this presentation. So in terms of like just going back to the method and making stories meaningful, I did want to kind of share a few things that I find useful. One is if you want to build a story around something, think about making it personal and relatable. Personal and relatable. The best way I think to do this is again collaboratively through active listening and through using language that your audience uses. Don't use jargon in your industry or the kind of terminology that you use internally in your organization. Think about the way that your audience is understanding and talking about something. Use that. I have a couple of examples from my work, but I don't think we have a lot of time to go into that.
I'd love to see the examples.
You want to see the example, or you want to hear about the examples? We had to develop. I worked for a long time in public health and sexual health, as you guys can tell. And we had a ton of brochures and pamphlets about different sexually transmitted infections. Right? This is how public health would share and teach. They're like, this is what chlamydia is. This is what herpes is. This is what gonorrhea is.
So they give paper to people.
Yes, but it was really technical. It was a brochure. It was technical. It didn't reflect, I always felt like it didn't really reflect the messiness of people's lives when they're in a position of their health, right? And their sexual health especially. So we did a call out, we got some funding from an organization. We did a call out and we hired, so our audience was young South Asian women. And we hired 3 South Asian women to act as peer writers for us. And we gave them different STIs. So one was chlamydia, one was gonorrhea, one was herpes. And they wrote they wrote a story about that STI. And it was brilliant. We put it up on a blog and we got a great response from it. We actually even did a study on how effective that was versus the technical fact sheets. And people found that the experiences, the technical fact sheets, nobody's going to deny that sexual health is important for you to know. right? People are very positive about that. But what the stories did is make it personal. So they were like, it's not just that sexual health is important for people to know, I should actually know about chlamydia. Whereas before, the fact sheets would not get them there. So they have a disassociation with something. Stories allow you to relate, right? So then one of the peers, for example, the chlamydia peer, call her the chlamydia peer, but she developed this story on about a young woman sitting in a waiting room in a clinic to get tested. And she kept thinking about the whole, like, how she was going to tell her mother if she tested positive, and how she was going to explain the treatment or the medication that she would need to use. And in that process of thinking about it, like, a lot of things came out, like how she was thinking about it, what her relationship with her mother was like. And that one was honestly one of the most powerful ones. We shared those stories with women in our focus groups. And the older women especially were like, oh my God, I would never want my daughters to sit and worry and have this much anxiety about something in a clinic and sit there alone. I need to tell my daughters that they're not alone in this, which was really amazing, because most of the time when you talk to older women in our previous focus groups about the fact sheets, they were like, that's not my daughter, she's never going to do that. Right? My daughter's not the one who's going to be sitting in a clinic. But you'd go through a story and then they're like, it doesn't matter, the stigma went away, and it was about, I just don't want this girl to go through this alone. And you build the empathy. So that is an example of the relatability. Yeah, you need, bring your peers in, bring people to make their own stories, right? Focus on the why. I think, again, when we think about methods, we're always thinking about what and how, and implementation is crucial, it's important, but you need to know, I think, why something is happening, right? That goes back to narrative. So anytime you're building something, think about why. I'm gonna leave that one there. I think in all your work, include a call to action. There has to be something that you are leaving your audience with, or your reader with, that engages them to do something further. What do you want them to do with it? Do you want them to just have feel good vibes at the end of it? That's great. If that's your purpose, fine. You just want them to feel cool. If you want them to change their mind about something, if you want for them to, have a different attitude, to advocate for something with their government, to do something different, then have that call to action. And it doesn't have to be it can be a subtle call to action. It could just be, get in touch with us for more information. It can be, this is where you go for more resources, or this is what the literature says, find out about it. But it has to be, I think you have to give somebody something, don't end. And I think the last one is be prepared. I mean, there's a ton of different tips, but we'll focus on be prepared. I think people have this sense that storytelling is a natural art, that people are just naturally good storytellers, and some people have a flair for it and others don't. I don't think that's true at all. I think you develop your skills to be a good storyteller, you develop your skills to craft good stories, and you have to prepare. Preparation leads us to the next bit, which is resources. So I have, a ton of resources here that I'm always reading about how to do things better. So I have a list of stuff, and this is what I do. And I'll read through them, and I just have, most of my books have post-its like this, and little notes, and then I take the notes and the post-its and I put them in another notebook. Because the science tells me that when I write things down, I remember them better, as opposed to when I read them or even type them. So I write it down. I have a little story bank book. And sometimes I'm even just writing things like, the Epic of Gilgamesh said this, or, this happened in here. And it's funny how you can kind of put those in as little nuggets, And I think I put this down in the workshop summary, that sometimes it's about changing attitudes. Sometimes it's just being better company when you're having dinner.
So this is your own ideas to the book, you're adding your own ideas to the book, or is it already in the book and you just...
Sometimes it's just extracting. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's a ton of really great things people have done, and really great stories that speak to the relevance in our world, right? When I actually with the Epic of Gilgamesh, you and I were together at this in the literature festival, and there was somebody who was talking about history, and they talked about the tale of Genji. Yeah, and has anyone ever heard of this tale?
No.
The tale of Genji?
Never.
And it's written by Mirasuki something. I can't even remember her name.
The Tale of Benji.
Genji.
Genji.
Yeah.
Because Genji is a movie about a dog. I was like,
She was a Hillong lady, I believe it was, who lived in, she was a courtesan in Japan, and she wrote a collection of stories, and that was, I think, the first written account of.
She wrote the first novel, so I looked up
first
her
novel.
novel. Yeah. So the first novel that we have in recorded history was written by this woman, and it's The Tale of Genji. How many of us have heard of it? Now you've heard of it before. And how many of us have heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh? That was again from, I guess, like our region, our Middle Eastern region. The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered the first recorded epic, first recorded story ever written. How many of us have heard of Homer's Iliad, the Odyssey?
Please, of course.
Everyone? No, you've not heard of the Iliad or the Odyssey?
oh yeah, the Greek.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, Homer Simpson.
But equally misunderstood movies.
And I mean, that in itself talks to narrative, right? We hear about the stories that we're taught, the ones that the school systems will deem more important than others, you know, and there's a larger narrative at play. So, I mean, that for me became a clear example of storytelling. I mean, we're sitting in there and I was just like, making that note down. I was like, yeah, this would be a really good thought exercise if you were to just talk to people and be like, how many of you have heard of this and this and this? And it's a very clear example of how we get access to information. And then it makes us think, well, who's giving us this access? Who has that power? Right? And why are we're not more active in that? Why am I not hearing more about these amazing people of color that have done really cool things? Not so much on the other side. So, I mean, that's an example of, yeah, I just collect a ton of stories, ton of examples, think about how they might be related to different contexts. I mean, you have to love doing that as well, I think. I really enjoy that process. Yeah, so that's, I think for me, it's also preparedness. You know, then you have this bank, you know when to pull out these stories when appropriate.
Preparedness means having read a lot, knowing about culture.
Or do you practice storytelling so that, you know, it gets better as you tell it to different audience and kind of like take feedback from how you did it the first time to how you can improve it to the second time,
Yeah.
so on and so forth?
All of those things, yes. Practice. Always take the opportunity to learn. You know, yes, at meetups, gather discussion, gather feedback, be well read. You know, like all of those things matter, I think. And remember your own stories, you know, like make them. Yes, write it down. Write it down. Everybody has different processes that they find useful. For me, it's writing it down and actually on paper and pen. That's the best way for me to learn. I know other people, like my husband, for example. He's very he's all on the phone. He makes post-it notes on his phone. You know, he'll do everything on his phone. He reads on his phone, and I can't do that. I'm like, I need paper. Yes. No, I do sometimes. So when I need to, right? When I need to, I do. So if I know I'm going to be preparing for a presentation for something, then I will go back to it. Yeah.
You've written about these books, right? Like you've written post-it notes for the books.
I've just written post-it notes for things I find interesting. So I've not even written anything about this book. Like I've just been like, oh, that I really like what he said there. Note, and I'll make a note of it. And then, you know, I'm thinking this would be a really good way to explain that. If I ever am in a position to explain it, you might not know when it'll be useful, but I think that's what kind of preparedness is, right? Like you equip yourself and you prepare in the off chance that you might be in the right place at the right time to talk about something. I actually got a client like that one. So, and this kind of goes back to also recognizing our own stories. So I had a client who was putting together a resource on homelessness and looking to find ways to communicate between businesses and homeless folks on the street, or street folks. And they were trying to think about what the best way to do it and who to kind of give that work to. And I think one of the big reasons why I got that work is because I was able to talk about a story of my own personal experience when I did frontline work with people. I had a very tough experience with someone who was street involved and living on the street, who came in and required some services and was not able to get what they wanted, and actually had a huge sort of episode in the office and told me that I was responsible for his death, or I was going to be responsible for his death, and yelled at and for his death. And that happened, yes, and talked about that. And I think when I was talking to her about it, when I was talking to this woman who was, telling me about this resource she wanted to develop, I relayed that story and I said, it's not, or I was talking about it and I said, you have to weigh both sides, right? It's not as though the narrative can always be one-sided. Sometimes you have to think about safety, sometimes you have to think about compassion. You want to be there, you want to be supportive and helpful, but you also need to think about who else is in that space and whether that space is safe, and whether it's being, how do you maintain balance in that space and how do you maintain support? And that's a very delicate balance, right? And I think knowing that for her, when she was talking to me about it, understanding that I had some nuanced experience of that allowed her to be like, you know what, I want you to do this project because I think it'll be in good hands because you understand the concept. You understand where some of these things come from. I think you have to be able, sometimes that preparedness also allows you to share about yourself, right? It's not always things you read in books, it's a lot of what you have experienced and knowing when to share that, and when the right time is to do that. So yeah. That is it, thank you. At the end there are some resources that I've listed. If you guys are interested, I have some of them here too. If you want to take photos of them or if you want to take photos of the resources, please do so. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah.
Any questions? All right, well, thank you, Vijaya. That was awesome.
Thank you, guys. I had a really good time. Thank you. It's really cool to meet everybody.
Can we see the book?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a few more.
Can we line it up? I'll just make a picture of the book.
Can we take a group selfie also from
Boss, look at this one.
Sorry, can I? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that one. I love that book. And if you guys ever want to get in touch with me, I have a couple of business cards here. Please feel free to take. Yeah, they're all here. Oh, you too. Thank you so much. Yeah, you can take a picture of the book and you can take my card and.
So you're a trainer for.
Thank you. Your name is? Emma, nice to meet you. Can I get a group photo? Yes. I'm always really bad at taking photos and I always forget.
I still don't know how to take a selfie. Just my hands are set up like doing what?
Not a shot for them.
The weird moves is like hard.
Just me, I'm good at it. I can do that.
Maybe we can all go on that side and come out.
I like carrying Kindle.